1 Corinthians is a very important book in the Pauline corpus. Most people go to Romans because it's the biggest letter, the longest letter, all these big themes of justification, the righteousness of God, Israel, and the Spirit, and ethics, and everything like that, which is all good. But 1 Corinthians is where you see a mixture of Paul as missionary, as pastor, as theologian, and struggling to help or make the Corinthians being less Corinthian and more in Christ. If they're going to be in Christ, then there's a lot of things that they've got to shed, a lot of cultural baggage, a lot of beliefs, a lot of practices, and practices that the people around them just took as absolutely normal. Like, you get up in the morning, visit your patron, offer a sacrifice in the temple, go have some good time at a brothel, then go back home and see your wife, or something like that. Stuff like that, he's trying to, if you like, sanctify them from, kind of purify for them from that, and getting them acting more like a church rather than a pagan philosophy club in Corinth that's got some quasi-Jewish or Eastern ideas. And I think it's a book it's relevant in every age, but I think in the current age, it's very relevant, whether it's factions or heresy or people wanting to play off favorites, debates about spiritual gifts or what's the best form of worship. Should we be singing hymns or choruses? And what about speaking in tongues and all this sort of thing? It's a book that's eternally relevant because I think people can always relate to it. So yeah, so here's a little summary of 1 Corinthians shot in Corinth. I'm also going to give my list of the best commentaries in Corinth and then finish off with a little bit of a summary at the end. So I hope you enjoy that.
I'm here in ancient Corinth, a city that Paul spent considerable amount of time in. He also wrote a number of letters to the Corinthians. I think at least 4, as far as we can tell. We've got 1 and 2 Corinthians. But Corinth was a problem church. I mean, if you read 1 Corinthians, I mean, there are a lot of serious issues going on. I mean, look at 1 Corinthians, it basically goes, his introduction and thanksgiving. Then he talks about the centrality of the cross. Chapters 2 and 3, he talks about factions based around certain church leaders. 4, he's got to kind of, put the Corinthians in their place because some of them think they're kind of, so much better than him, or they've moved on. 5, you've got an example of, or a case of incest that's got to be dealt with. That's more in the sense of some guy probably shacking up with his stepmother. Chapter 6, you've got lawsuits amongst believers. Chapter 7, you've got the questions pertaining to singleness and celibacy in light of Christian hope. Chapter 8, you've got the ethical conundrum of, can Christians eat food sacrificed to idols, and how to exercise your convictions on that in a responsible way. Chapter 9, Paul's talking about the rights of an apostle, how he exercises his apostolic vocation. Chapter 10, you've got a warning about idolatry, participating too much in the pagan world. And while Paul can flex on eating food sacrificed to idols, he's got no flexibility when it comes to eating food in a pagan temple.
In chapter 11, the focus seems to be on propriety in worship. Things are getting a little bit disordered, a little bit chaotic, and that's even extending over into the Lord's Supper, where class divisions seem to be finding themselves present in the way that they do the Lord's Supper. There's a difference between the slaves and then the other people who go ahead and eat all the food before the working people arrive. Chapter 12 is a debate about spiritual gifts going on in Corinth, and some people are arguing about which gift makes you the most spiritual, which one's got the most status and superiority, and Paul responds in chapter 13, not with a wedding sermon, but arguing the real mark of Christ-centered spirituality is love. Knowledge, tongues, that all ends, but love is what continues. Now, he doesn't want to discourage people from exercising their spiritual gifts, but he wants the church to be unified, to put the gifts in their proper place. That's what chapter 14 is about. And then in chapter 15, some people are treating the resurrection as a kind of optional extra, like it's the garnish on the plate that you can move to the side. And Paul says, no, resurrection is a big deal. I know Greeks are not really into it. They prefer the immortality of the soul, but resurrection is not dispensable to the gospel. And then in chapter 16, Paul talks about the collection he's taking up for the churches in Jerusalem, gives some personal requests, and then some final greetings. And that's the end of 1 Corinthians. Let me do an excursus on my favorite 1 Corinthians commentaries. Number one has to be my friend and former boss, Brian Rosner, with his buddy Roy Champa in the Pillar series. That's very good, very thorough, very erudite, and always sensible options taken. So that's number one. Number two has to be Anthony Thistleton's. Thistleton was brilliant on hermeneutics. He understands historical background. Think he's a little bit muddled about the overrealized eschatology problem, but that's a great one too, and that's in the New International Greek Testament Commentary. A smaller one in the Interpretation series by Richard B. Hayes, now of blessed memory. Hayes's commentary is short, but it's pretty good. I really do like it, and it's probably one that's less overwhelming than some commentaries, but still comes to a lot of sensible and reasonable judgments. The other one I have to say, it's a little bit older now, but Gordon Fee's, I think, really did set a pretty high bar for commentaries on 1 Corinthians when it came out in, I think, 1987. That was in the NICNT series. That was a good volume, and I think it's still worth consulting. I'm always a big fan of David Garland. He's such a sensible exegete. He's always got very reasoned, measured conclusion. That's in the BCNT series. Pretty much anything he writes, I think, is always worth consulting. What's recently come out, and I've only just dabbled into this a little bit, is Michael Gorman's. He's got like a kind of theological interpretation of 1 Corinthians, which, from what I can tell from my cursory glance, it does look very good. Another one I'd recommend is by B.J. Oropesa in the New Covenant Commentary series. That's a series I edit with Craig Keener. That's a good volume because B.J. knows his stuff, and he writes something that's very readable, very concise. That's probably a good starting point for a lot of students. Fem Perkins in the Paideia series is great. I think Fem Perkins is very underrated. She's someone who's always worth reading, and I think because she's written such a wide number of areas, she's got a very good general knowledge, and she brings that to bear on any topic that she writes on. So I think Perkins is a good example of why generalists can write some really good biblical commentaries. On the practical side, there's Andrew Wilson's commentary. I can't remember what series it's in, but I thought that was pretty good. But if you want a really good commentary for preaching and teaching at the level of sermon prep and Bible study, the one you need to watch out for is Justin Hardin's commentary. Now, that is really good because it's been well edited, I'll tell you that much, because I was the editor for that volume. But he's got a brilliant way of explaining the text so easily, but he's also got some really good applications. And 1 Corinthians is a text that screams out for application. If there's any biblical book that's relevant to our own age, a time where people are seeking status and their sexual excess and the denial of Christian doctrine, 1 Corinthians is it. So Justin Hardin, that would probably be the number one commentary I'd recommend to preachers or people doing Bible study. But if you wanted one just to help you get through Bible college, I'd probably go through Rosner and Champa. So that's my thoughts on 1 Corinthians. I mentioned of dispatches. I know Tom Schreiner's got a 1 Corinthians commentary out in the Tyndall series. I haven't seen it yet, but hey, students build shrines to Tom Schreiner because he helped them get through seminary with his many writings. So Tom Schreiner will always be worth consulting. Yeah, so those are the commentaries on 1 Corinthians I would advise you get yourself hooked up with. So that's a summary of 1 Corinthians, very relevant today. It deals with topics of sexual immorality, divisions, celebrity ministers, theology, death and resurrection, focusing on Christ. As our world becomes increasingly neo-pagan, 1 Corinthians feels increasingly relevant.